finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
All right, this week we have an amazing guest, Dr. Paul Alexander. He has a PhD in evidence-based medicine. Really interesting career over the last couple of years. He was an advisor for the World Health Organization with regards to COVID at the beginning of the pandemic. Actually moved into an advisory role at the Health and Human Services as well. It was an advisor in the previous administration. So really very interesting guy. He is totally data-driven. That is his entire career. We're going to get into some pretty deep conversations about studies with regards to the vaccines and particularly in children. But first, May has a word for us.
Yeah. First of all, our sponsor this week is Locum Story. And have you ever considered a different way of practicing medicine?
Yes.
Whether you are burned out, need a change of pace, or are looking to supplement your income, locum tenens might be the solution for you. If you're not sure where to start, locumstory.com is the place where you can get real, unbiased answers to your questions. They answer basic questions like what is locum tenens to more complex questions about pay ranges, taxes, various specialties, and how locum tenens can work for you. Go to locumstory.com or drpodcastnetwork.com/locumstory and get the answers.
We have the awesome privilege of interviewing Dr. Paul Alexander. Dr. Alexander has a PhD in evidence-based medicine from McMaster, and he has some incredible insights on the vaccine, specifically in children, what we're going to discuss, which has been really in the news in the last several days. So, Dr. Alexander, welcome to BS Free MD, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you very much for having me on this good show. Well, just briefly, in terms of my academic background, I did graduate school at the University of Toronto in epidemiology. I went on to Oxford in England and studied clinical epidemiology at graduate school. Then I returned to McMaster in evidence-based medicine. And I schooled under Dr. Gordon Guyot in Canada, and he was one of the founders of that term, evidence-based medicine, and that whole domain. And I did my postdoc with him. I still do some research with his research groups. So that's academics. In 2001, interestingly, just before 9/11, I was very interested in biological warfare because of my IP training. And I attended a small program at Johns Hopkins looking at biological warfare and how to weaponize pathogen and deliver it into cities. We used Baltimore, Maryland as the tabletop exercise. And I actually got lectured by Dr. Donald Henderson, who was the person who eradicated smallpox in the early 1970s. And it was quite interesting. After that, we remained friends and I would write to him. And I studied more on bioterrorism. And I asked him to be my PhD supervisor at Johns Hopkins, and he actually agreed. Sadly, he had passed away now, but I made the decision to go to McMaster mainly for funding purposes, because at that time I was not a resident of the United States, and it would have been difficult for me to raise the funding as a PhD student in Canada. So in Canada, I remained and I went on to do my work in Canada. In terms of career work, I worked prior for the Canadian government as an infectious disease epidemiologist, posted across the world to different countries on tuberculosis, HIV control. I worked for the World Health Organization in 2008 as a regional epidemiologist for Europe, with countries of Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Turkey falling on my desk in terms of risk factor, surveillance, etc. Then I worked at, interestingly, in early of 2020, before the pandemic began, I was asked by WHO Geneva and PAHO, DC, to help in their pandemic response in terms of evidence synthesis and systematic reviews and getting all of their pandemic responding in order. At the same time, I was asked by the Trump administration to join the pandemic response as a senior COVID pandemic advisor, which I did. And I had to resign from the position at WHO because it was a conflict of interest and I couldn't do both at the same time. So since then, I departed the administration in September or so. And I've just been supporting different groups, research groups internationally, and speaking and writing and working, arguing against the vaccination of children, and just looking at the overall response, particularly the use of early outpatient treatment, because I am an advocate for that. And, in the beginning, people were skeptical because we didn't really understand the approach. But quickly, when I joined on to this group led by Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Harvey Risch, Dr. George Fareed, and Dr. Zelenko, including Dr. Pierre Corey, who champions ivermectin, etc. You really get to see the fact that once the early treatment is applied early in the sequelae, and that is the issue. That is the issue. The detractors tried to destroy the early treatment approach, but they were designing their studies to fail, and they were giving the treatment late in the disease course when the viral replication had already taken place and the person had already sickened tremendously, so they would be less effective. So I am a proponent of it, and that's what I'm advocating, and I'm working with Risch, etc., on pushing this, and that's where I am right now.
Okay, so when we get to, you've been in the thick of, the COVID world, World Health Organization, Health and Human Services, the whole deal. So you've seen behind the curtain, so to speak, as far as policy, and that's because you're an evidence-based medicine guy. So if we go back to the evidence, if we're going to talk about vaccination and specifically vaccination in children, I remember when in November of last year, when the EUA came out for the Pfizer vaccine, and I was just stunned. I mean, I'm not an academic. I'm a country doctor. And I'm like 43,000 people in the entire cohort. About half of those got the placebo and half got the vaccine. And they only had what? Like 160 infected. 160. And I'm like,
yeah.
What 100? And I turned to May and I was just like, this is so overwhelmingly underpowered. How on earth can they say that this is, you could maybe say it's effective, but you can't say anything about safety with 162 people. Am I off base?
No. You're actually correct. And I just want to make sure that you understand something. My training is more I'm kind of like a Harvey Risch light. I have to make sure I remember who he is. But the point is, I don't pretend to be more skilled or expertise than either of you here. And I want people to understand that, we all went to academics and stuff in the past, and everybody brings different strengths to the table. And I have realized that even lay persons with no schooling, no formal schooling or advanced schooling, they actually have cobbled together enough knowledge now. They could run rings around a lot of these people working in CDC and NIH. So I'm very impressed and inspired by that. But you raised very important points. The key is, here they were basing a decision to bring a vaccine based on 162 events in the placebo arm and 8 events in the treatment arm. So 170 events. We have decided that we're going to vaccinate hundreds of millions, billions of people across America and the world, which we've never done before. That's number one. Number two, when we do our own modeling, we did some modeling at McMaster some years ago, and we looked at randomized controlled trials, and we looked at what are the optimal information size for the events, and it's published. And I've actually shared it around a lot of scientists to show them that when you have 500 events and less in an RCT, So you can start from 200 events and less, which this trial did have, 170. When you have 200 events and less in both of the arms collectively in a trial, that's the outcome events, the trial is at serious risk of overestimating the treatment effect. And when you go up to 300, 400, when you get to less than 500, the risk of overestimating the treatment effect is severe. And it's a flag for this being a very high risk of bias studies, meaning that if this study was run with the proper sample, the proper event number, and to the proper duration, that those results would probably disappear, where the intervention group may end up with much more events and the difference would decline. So the issue here is the study, just the methods and the analysis is so flawed, because if I were doing an assessment of the risk of bias of this particular RCT, I would flag it, and I know many other people would, for severe risk of bias because they stopped early for benefit, which is a red flag. And we argue that is what we call a random high. So that means that at that point, you are getting the outcome that you want. And researchers are very guilty of manipulating the study this way. Had you let it run to the proper sample size, the proper duration, those events would have probably been more evenly distributed, and you would not have found an effect, the estimated effect you did. And an important issue is that there's a lot of discussion. Something was published in the BMJ by the editor, and it actually was very eye-opening, where they showed that in Pfizer's submission, they noted that they omitted 3,400 people, 3,400 participants from the analysis. And they claimed that they omitted it because these people were highly suspected of having COVID, but they were not lab confirmed. So for their own purposes, we decided to set them aside. Now, when you take that data and you put it into the existing trial, that 95% drops to 19%. So there's no effect. So there's a lot of questions about that 95%. That 95% is really, we argue, not 95%. And we've asked them to provide a proper, transparent, and explicit explanation as to how you can just remove 3,400 people and not give a proper explanation. That explanation has not been forthcoming from the vaccine developers. So there's a lot of, and one more thing, so I don't forget, that 95% is based on a relative risk reduction. Now, you know that when people report relative risk reduction, is really to manipulate you. The estimate that we are really interested in is the absolute effect, the absolute risk reduction. And when you look at the absolute risk reduction, is actually, I think, around 0.7, 0.9, etc. So if you tell a patient that this vaccine with the potential harms, because we did not exclude harms, because we did not run it to duration, we did not do the safety check, only confers a 0.7% absolute risk reduction to you, then that would automatically change the decision to have the vaccine versus lying to them and telling them it's 95% efficacious.
Wow.
Right. No, I do this. I explain the difference between absolute and relative risk to patients based on SIDS. Back to sleep. If you put a child on its back to sleep, an infant, you reduce the relative risk of SIDS by, it cuts it in half. I mean, it's an amazing thing. But then when you look at the actual incidence, the incidence of SIDS is still extremely rare. And so you're going from a 1 in 250,000 or a 1 in 500,000 event or whatever it is, I can't remember the exact numbers, to a 1 in 250,000. So the absolute risk reduction is really not that great. The relative risk reduction is overwhelmingly great. And I remember our son, when he was an infant, he would never sleep on his back. Like, he would go crazy and be screaming. And I had this sort of dark humor, and I said, okay, he's sleeping on his tummy. And May's like, whoa, it's dangerous. I said, what's more dangerous is a 1 in 60,000 chance of homicide if he doesn't sleep and we go crazy and, harm our child. And I said, so in that regard, the absolute risk was overwhelmingly in his favor to sleep on his tummy. And now, he's doing very well and an engineering student and all the rest
of it. We lived.
And everyone lived, great outcome. And that's the thing is this, I tried to explain this to patients that, only 1% of the people in that trial that in the placebo arm got the infection. So if 100% of people take the vaccine and it's 100% effective and 100% safe, which of course nothing is, then you've only reduced the absolute risk reduction to your society by 1%. Correct? Am I reading the math right?
Yeah, but the real issue is, where would people place value? And everything should be down to a risk management decision. And when you explain to them that way and you say, consider the benefits. What are the benefits of this vaccine? This is the troubling thing. We've gotten to find out after the fact, well, we actually knew that from what they published, that the vaccine is only set up to deal with mild COVID. It was not set up to deal with stopping transmission or infection. And I know you guys are experts, so I don't have to go through it, but it wasn't set up for severe COVID or hospitalization or death or preventing death or anything like that, which are the patient important outcomes of patients. This is what I'm interested in. I want to know, will it stop me from going to the hospital? Will it prevent my death? It does not do that. So the reality is that we are administering a vaccine in an environment where the benefit is so almost zero, and the potential harms are there, which we are seeing. We argued for in the beginning, and now we are seeing it play out. We look at the myocarditis with everything, and the cases in the VAERS system, and for a virus that now we look at the case fatality, the infection fatality rate that is actually lower than seasonal influenza. So the question is, we did all of this. We grinded society to a halt. We suffered. Look, people need to understand something, that when people like Atlas or myself, when we were part of the administration behind the scenes, our involvement was, while we have the scientific part and the epidemiology part, was much more from a policy perspective, because we were arguing that you have to take the larger implications of the policy into account. You can't just lock a society down because, this pathogen is here, let's just close it out, and not understand the crushing harms that are going to accrue because of your policy decision, and be unwilling to go back and revisit your policy decisions and tweak them if need be. So I'll just tell you that in the White House and stuff, we were beginning to see data was coming into different parts, the HHS, etc., where Americans, and you could have seen the pivot by Trump and his push to open the society, while Fauci, they were arguing with him on the podium to keep it closed, keep the state shut, keep schools closed. He was pushing to open schools because we were seeing the data that was showing that Americans, business owners, employees in businesses were committing suicide. Children across America were self-harming at alarming rates and were taking their lives. And it was not supposition and speculation, it was a fact. So that scared everyone, and I know it scared POTUS too. And that you could see his fight to open the society and open schools, etc. So the battle was, to me, it was insane, because even today you have states and you have parts of America where the public schools are still closed. And there's this sort of unholy alliance between the CDC and the teachers' unions in keeping school, where we know that school is probably the safest place for a child and a teacher. The median age of a teacher in America is 41 or so, median 41. Teachers are at little, if any, risk in the school setting, particularly from a child. And keeping school closed is actually, to me, almost criminal, because children have suffered and lost so much, particularly minority children. So this is a terrible. This is not over, because we still have the pandemic is winding down, but we still have so much pain out there because there's been so much loss.
Yeah,
we
go
definitely
ahead.
we definitely see that on our end where we're working in the community from children. We've done telehealths and office visits, and we have friends and family, who've lost kids because their lives have been taken away because they've literally been locked at home and they don't have their social supports, their athletics, what they've lived for. We've seen kids suicides and mental health on the rise, and it's heartbreaking. And I get so frustrated because we're hearing from the teachers side of things, not everybody obviously, but the teachers union saying, well, our lives are at risk because we didn't sign up for this. And it's just fear that they're filled with the black plague of death, and all teachers will be dropping dead if they even go around children. And there's this mixed signal and agenda, which totally makes me mad. But you're right. For some kids, it's the only place they get a meal, even, where we're living in rural America. And the implications have been, crazy. And now it's the push to vaccinate all these children with this still medication where we don't know what the long-term implications are going to be. And now we're seeing, and we've seen it ourselves where we work, but harmful effects of a vaccine in an otherwise healthy child. And they're starting to get, I've seen the myocarditis, we've seen all kinds of things. And so and
this is my quote. I've done family practice in the country for almost 30 years, and I did obstetrics for 12 years. So I had a very robust pediatrics practice. It was incredibly rewarding. So I have administered thousands and thousands of vaccinations because I had all these little kids, so they go through their early vaccines, DPT, et cetera. And in 4 months, once the vaccines were released in November, December, in 4 months, I saw more reactions, significant reactions where people would have to miss work, et cetera, from the COVID vaccine than I saw in 28 years of medical practice in totality. I know it's anecdotal, but wow. We give people a flu shot. Some people maybe have a little reaction, but people don't miss 2 or 3 days of work with a fever of 102 from a flu shot. This thing is so, I told patients, I said, this is like a live virus. It makes spike proteins. Spike proteins are the nasty little buggers that cause the COVID disease. And we're giving those to you. And we don't know, how people respond, to making how much mRNA makes how much spike protein in what patient. We don't know that. So, so I want to move on to the study with kids. So if I remember correctly, it was 2,200 children, and I don't think the vaccine arm had a single case. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the vaccine arm had 0, and the placebo arm, I think, had 18, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right, 18.
Yeah.
So 2,200 total, about 1,100 in each arm, and you had 0 cases in the vaccine arm, and you had 18 cases. And so we take that data, which is even profoundly more underpowered than the original study, and now we're going to vaccinate 12 to 17-year-olds for a disease that they have virtually 0 risk of significant consequences for. How does that make sense?
Well, it makes no sense. And the thing about it is that, look, when I was there behind the scenes, some very really good people in my office and stuff, and we'd have these discussions. And I was on record. I made my voice heard that, look, I wasn't for the vaccines. I'll be blunt. Because of the issue about early treatment and stuff, and because the approach that we were taking, which was, strongly double down, triple down, protect the elderly, in the nursing homes, and allow the low risk in the society to make common sense decisions, take reasonable precautions, and let them and harmlessly and naturally they could go about their lives. and you augment that with improved hand washing, etc. I stated, I said, if you're going to use this vaccine, it should only be on the high risk elderly people, and let them make a risk management decision once properly informed, but no one else. Now, if you look at the CDC data, CDC's own data suggests that 0 to 70 years old, the risk of survival is 99.997%. So basically, people 70 years old and below, once you're reasonably healthy, you're going to bump up into COVID if you ever do, and you're not going to have any problem. So the question is really, vaccine should have only be prioritized for, to me, in my opinion, older than that, older than 70, and people who had medical conditions. I know that COVID gives way to age for like obese persons, or if a young person has grave underlying medical conditions. It's like Dr. Marty Makary from Johns Hopkins. He said in an interview recently that the number of children that have passed or deemed have died due to COVID, I think across America since the start, is about 300. And it's a very small number relative to the amount of deaths that we've incurred. But any death is a tragedy, is a painful, gut-wrenching issue. But whether we're going to have a discussion about whether it was due to COVID or with COVID or whatever, the important point that he made was there, Johns Hopkins looked at every single case of a child designated as a child in the United States. They did a deep study, and they found not one child that passed connected to COVID died without serious underlying conditions. And that's a very important thing to know. And that was his reporting. And it makes sense from the point of view. Now, look, there's no absolutes, because we know that the common cold or regular seasonal influenza, even in a mild year, could kill a healthy person. This is what happens in life. And you guys being clinicians too and doctors, you know this better than me. You can have a healthy person, and for some reason that is you can't really explain, they passed away. And so it is a tragic situation. But the reality is that from all that we know, children are such a low risk, almost statistical zero, of becoming severely ill or dying from this. I mean, I looked at the statistics, but I'm just trying to put it into perspective. Around 600 American children die a year, from what I've read recently, from accidental drowning in their pools, in their backyard pools. Now, again, that's a tragedy, but you have a pool, you made the decision to have a pool, and that's the risk, I suppose one could argue, that we take to live in a free society. Accidents happen. Of course, you want none of it to happen, and you try and you take future precautions, etc. But so what I guess what I'm trying to say is that when you put COVID with children into perspective, the response has been unreal and unreasonable and reckless, because if you have a vaccine that with such a small sample size, with such a small number of events, and you ran it for 2 months, you didn't run it for the length of duration we need so we could properly exclude any harms. How could you turn around and want to administer to children when you could give them a shot that could set them up for a lifetime of disability and possible death? So there's no sound reason, no justification for this, none.
I agree with you. On the flip side, in some of the physician community groups I'm following just as a fly on the wall and participating, but the devil's advocate answer to that is they're arguing that COVID infections in children and adults, even though the risk of death could be so small in a healthy individual with no comorbidities, the risk of potential long-term effects from the virus is such toward that the risk-benefit changes so that you should get the vaccine to protect you from the possibility of long-term, long COVID or cardiomyopathy from the COVID infection. Initially they were finding all these athletes, football players that got infected with COVID, and they did this study and they found that they were getting myocarditis post-COVID, and therefore, the push was get the vaccine so you don't get COVID infection, and therefore you don't have long-term morbidity. So that's, the argument that we're up against is, are we going to have, is the benefit for the vaccine to help prevent getting the infection and long-term morbidity from the COVID infection, or now, we have to look at the risk of giving a vaccine and causing long-term morbidity?
Well, that's the thing. They talk about long COVID. Long COVID is just such a total mystery because there's people that have super mild symptoms, test positive for, the native virus, and they get long COVID, and the long COVID's way, way worse than any symptoms they ever had with the original infection. But we don't know. We have no idea if the vaccine might cause long COVID. The vaccine might cause pericarditis that's worse than native COVID because you haven't studied it long enough. That's the whole point. The vaccine might be the greatest thing in the entire world. You just can't say it because it hasn't been studied long enough to really know what the harms are.
Mm-hmm. But when you look at the VAERS database today, and you see, you mentioned it earlier, and what you said is so true. When you stated the number of adverse events, the reality about it is we make this connection based on a temporal link, and we are seeing approximately 100 to 200 adverse events and deaths in the VAERS every year, and all of a sudden we have 6,000, and it's happening 1 to 2 to 3 days post-vaccine. So we know it's connected to the vaccine in some way. The question is trying to really unravel it to understand what exactly is happening. And but the truth of the matter is there's a lot of credible scientists, big people, very smart people like a Dr. Risch, etc. Look at Dr. I think it's Frank Malone. I think he's the guy that invented the mRNA platform, mRNA vaccines overall and DNA vaccines. And he is one of these people out there with us banging away at the system saying, look, there's a problem here with the vaccines and these are the issues. And so it's not people just making stuff up. And the thing is, what I think is the most frightening thing is that we are coming forward arguing for the children situation, and the amount of hammering and slander and smearing and attacks you're getting when you're trying to potentially save lives here, and you're just saying, look, pause this issue, slow it down, stop even, because we need to get this right when we're talking about vaccinating children. It's not a thing that you could undo the vaccine, and a child has 70, 80 years of rich life ahead of them. So the risk benefit decision is a different one to make. And if it confers no benefit and only potential harms, why would you subject your child to that? And then there's a whole issue of ethical consent, which is a big problem because people think that they are taking these vaccines and they're not being properly. I can't think of anybody who's been properly ethically consented. And if you're going to administer to a child, what does that mean? Are you going to change the age of consent to the child? How is that possible when a child isn't cognitively able to make that kind of decision and to understand all of the issues? And so it's they're doing a lot of things that on face value look so wrong, and it just makes no sense. And what boggles your mind is that you're saying, but these are scientists too, and public health people and doctors too. Why are they doing this? What are they seeing that I'm not seeing? I don't understand it.
And the other thing that, I'll throw it out there into the waves is what we're seeing, people getting vaccinated, or their children or their families, and they're saying, we're doing this for society. It's not, we're doing this for us. It's like, we got vaccinated to save society, which is a whole other topic and snowball.
Well, when we interviewed Harvey, he brought up the fact that, he had heard a quote from a parent where their child had, died from a vaccine complication, and they said, my child died to make the country safe or whatever. And I'm like, my goodness, the delusion is, it's become a cult. That's just the way I see it. It's become this pseudoscience religion, and doctors are very, very susceptible to peer pressure, because you get hammered in medical school. You want to be safe, you don't want to kill people, do what I say, I'm the attending, and you get this sort of there's a little bit of soul crushing that goes on, which makes sense because you are dealing with life and death. But the dark side of that is the inability to think for yourself sometimes in the physician community is just, I can't explain it. It's bizarre to me, but I think it's worse than in other places. Lawyers think for themselves because they're lawyers, right? But like, we read these online groups and in various medical groups, and you see advertisements where they have I'm a family doctor, and they have a beautiful picture of this this person's 3 and 4 year old, and if the vaccine was available for my 4-year-old, I'd give it to them. And I'm like, have you read a journal? It's beyond comprehension to me.
Well, I think a lot of the misconception out there is people think, the government has made it, it's free, it's available, so I take it. And, I can't understand that thinking. Not because something is available that you have it, you touch it, you take it. You have to think about, do I need it? And if you don't need it, why would you go and do it? Yes, I agree with everything you just said, all of the peer pressure. And the thing about it is that when you look at the situation and you ask yourself, what is the value of giving these children this? The argument that Fauci and they came and this whole thing had several lies, and the argument Fauci and they made was with this children and herd immunity, and it's like the lie from the beginning out of the box, which again people like Atlas and me were fighting. And this was not our job, but this is what we were up against. We were up against a task force because he joined in August. I joined at the end of May. So task force was already formed by the end of February, beginning of March, somewhere around there. And Fauci and they had come out of the box with a few lies that were already set in stone that really colored this response and damaged it and doomed it. And 3 or 4 of them that come to mind is the key lie, which was that we all at equal risk of severe outcome if infected. That was a catastrophic lie, and that doomed us. Because today, it has Johnny at 15 years old in his closet hiding still, at the prime of his life, scared to come out and play because he thinks he's at the same risk as 85-year-old grandmother who has underlying medical conditions. And don't care what you tell him, he can't understand that you're not at the same risk. We knew very early on that COVID was amenable to risk stratification. We saw that. We saw that your baseline risk was prognostic on your mortality. And we saw that how once you take a more focused approach, age stratified approach, you could target treatment and you are really trying to focus on the higher risk groups. And that statement on everybody's at equal risk really hurt this response. The statement on asymptomatic spread as being a driver hurt this response because that is not true. The statement on recurrent infection also hurt us. It's not true. You have very, very rare instances, if at all, we could find one case. If we can, most of them we can argue is with flawed PCR testing result. The fourth issue is the flawed PCR test, catastrophic failure. That test is pretty much what shaped this pandemic and have us to where we are. Because you have a test that you have, we knew that the optimal cycle spin was about 20 to 24. And you have the CDC setting it at 40. We knew over 30, everything was viral dust and fragments, and that it wasn't viable, culturable virus, infectious virus. So everything was just a lie and upside down. And when Fauci came out a couple of months ago and said, well, we need to vaccinate children because we can't get to herd immunity, right? So when we were in the administration and we mentioned herd immunity, the press and everyone, that was like a curse word. How dare you people mention that word? Because we were talking immunology and virology. That's what you're trying to achieve with a vaccine program. You want to get the population level herd immunity, right? So now it's the key word for them. So let's go with, they now have embraced the term. So let's go with it. He said that we needed 85% of the population vaccinated to get to herd immunity. Now, for him to make that statement demonstrates that he doesn't read the science, or he doesn't understand. I don't understand what's wrong with Dr. and even the director of the CDC, because to make that statement, you have to discount, which demonstrates the fallacy and the lies by them. You have to discount the 15 to 20% of the American population off the bat who have some sort of prior cross protection from prior common cold coronaviruses. That's on the table right there. Then look at the 35 million Americans who were infected. So that's another 10%. But by CDC's own calculations, they have a ratio where they had put out of mid of 2020 where it's really 6-1. I think Redfield had said for every one case lab confirmed, there are really 5 or 6 that are missed out there. So you're really saying that about 200 million Americans were infected. So that's 200 million Americans who are immune. So when you put everybody together, just them, you have 60 or 70% of the population. So it was a lie to say, America, we saw from around middle of December, third week of December, last week of December, first week of January, we saw all of the hospitalizations, all of the infections and deaths going down. America was already winding down this pandemic before the first shot was in anybody's arms. And before the 3 weeks, by March for it to take effect, we had already reached herd immunity in a bunch of states in America. So to give any credit to the vaccine is a lie. That's number one. And for Fauci to say we need children to drive to that herd immunity, that is also a lie. Children is not to be part of that. And that's the lie. The lie is that children have to be used now to help protect the older persons. That's a bogus argument because then he doesn't understand immunology.
Well, you know, I remember this was a long time ago. It was probably a year or more ago. I found an article where they had Iceland is so small. It's like 350,000 people or so. And they basically tested everybody. They said, hey, we got this, we have this robust, healthy society. We have the ability to just basically test everybody. It's a small sample size. So they basically tested everybody. And I don't think they found a single case of vertical transmission from a child to an adult. Every adult, when they did the contact tracing, every child that was infected from an adult to a child. And then there was another article I saw where North Carolina, when they opened their schools, they contact traced 90,000 people in the school system. And I think they found 5 or 6 transmissions from child to adult. So for whatever reason, and again, I have no medical explanation for this, kids don't seem to get very sick, and they seem to be terrible vectors. I mean, they're terrible vectors of this. I mean, influenza, they're spectacularly great vectors, but it's just weird. I mean, is it because they have some robust mucosal immunity, so they inhale the virus and kill it before it gets into their bloodstream? Or I don't know. I that one's just been a mystery to me.
Well, I mean, you guys being the clinicians and the scientists in this area, probably, probably even much more than myself in this, but I'll just echo what you just said. I want to talk about the ACE2. We have this study that came out mid 2020, published in the journal Nature, because you mentioned studies. The journal Nature looked at a sample of about 10 million people, and and in that were adult and children. And they followed these people, and all of the persons who were positive, they looked at all of their contacts through contact tracing, and they found not one case of transmission, not one secondary transmission. There was this study, the French Alps study, that was published, I think, in Clinical Infectious Diseases. That study was of a child. They looked at a child who visited 3 different schools in the French Alps region and interacted with many different teachers and about 120 different kids in different schools. And the child was positive for COVID. And they found that the child transmitted to no teacher and to no child. And even more potent is the study recently in Sweden by Ludvigsson in the New England Journal of Medicine, where he reported and he got slandered and smeared and doxxed. And I think he even wrote a paper where he's stopped science now and he's stopped practicing. He's given up. He says he's not interested because of what they did to his name. But he reported that in Sweden over the last year, he looked at all 1.95 million Swede children, 16 years and below in school, from kindergarten to primary, all. And of all 1.9 million, so let's say 2 million kids under 16. And he looked at, there were no masks. So there was no masking and no school closures. Schools remain open full time. Masks were not permitted. They found a very, very small handful on both hands of case infections and 0 deaths. And it was his study that woke everybody up because it was such a large sample size over such a long time. And they found that the teachers had the rate of infection in teachers in that study was identical to the rate of infection for other professions in society. So it was not that teachers were at more risk from students, and the fact that there were no severe outcomes, no nothing. So that Swedish study actually is a seminal study. But to what you asked, or I'm sure you know of this study. There's a study by Patel in JAMA, the way they looked at, they actually look at the ACE2 receptors in the nasal epithelia. And they looked at it in adults and teenagers and young kids, all the way down to elementary school, young kids. And they found in a age stratified manner that little children have much fewer ACE receptors expressed in the nasal epithelia than older children and adults. And the argument was that is part of the explanation, along with prior common cold cross protection, as to why children don't acquire infection, because the apparatus is just not there here. And that's the argument. If you don't mind, this is the argument that we've been making, and like Dr. Byron Brittle in Canada, a colleague of mine. Now I'm in the States, I'm in the US, but I'm also Canadian. Anyway, he's gotten pilloried and destroyed by the Canadian public and the press and academia. They've threatened his life. His own academic colleagues, professors, threatened his family and his life. And because he was the one that came out 2 weeks ago and he said that based on the information from the Japanese regulatory agency, we now have data to show that the spike in the vaccine, when the vaccine is put into the deltoid muscle, that the assumption that it stays in the injection site and maybe only to the local lymph drainage node is false, because they found, now it was an animal model, they found that the vaccine was accumulating in organs, tissue throughout the body in places that it was not found or felt to even go prior, and particularly in the ovaries in the female rats, and crossing the blood-brain barrier, etc. But the argument we are making for parents, and this is it's a hypothesis we have, and maybe I'll present it here quickly in 1 minute. This is the argument we're making to parents. If we know that children don't get infected normally, and we know that by the data across the world for the last 15 months, That's not your statement or mine. That is the data. We know children don't get infected regularly and they don't spread it and they don't get severely ill. We know that. So over time, we were trying to figure out why. What is the difference between a child and an older person or an adult? Now we also have data to show that children don't have the ACE receptor in the nasal epithelium. So here's our hypothesis. If this was their natural protection, the lack of ACE2 receptors in the nasal epithelium, so you couldn't have the upper respiratory tract or even lower respiratory tract infection because it couldn't get past here, the nose. But now you are injecting into the deltoid muscle, and we found too that despite the constituency of the vaccine, the lipid nanoparticle, so therefore the spike eventually is accumulating throughout the body, then you are going to bypass that natural protection that a child has. And in the future, after you start vaccinating children, not yet, you have to start vaccinating them first. All of these deaths and adverse events we've seen in the VAERS database would start accumulating in kids. And that's our hypothesis, and that is our concern.
Yeah, I think
that's frightening.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I saw some stat. I have absolutely no idea where it came from, and so it's worth exactly. It may be worth nothing, but where there was like 200 million newborns in 2020, 200 million babies were born in 2020, and there wasn't a single severe COVID case in any of these newborns, which is just wild. So maybe as you go closer to birth, as time goes by, you grow more and more and more of these ACE2 receptors or something. That seems to make the most sense because it's like they have this, newborns have this super extra ability to not get COVID. Whereas if it was influenza, H1N1, if it was, any other disease, newborns are
RSV
are unbelievably more susceptible. Well, yeah, RSV. I've admitted tons of kids with RSV, and guess what? We don't have an RSV vaccine because when they tried to make that, it caused, antibody dependent enhancement and killed kids. That took what, like 5 or 6 months for them to pull that vaccine during that trial. So, who knows?
Mm-hmm. Wow.
This is a very troubling situation. And, like the WHO came out 2 days ago and said children not to be vaccinated. Then yesterday they readjusted it and said they've watered the statement down a bit now and saying that basically removed that statement, not advocating for vaccination at this time. So of course, from the political point of view, they got hammered. So they had to now come and retract. And then you have the FDA last night I saw the FDA is going to put some warning on the vaccines for teenagers for myocarditis. So at least the FDA is recognizing the problem. So, and I think the CDC also had made some statement also that there's a problem with myocarditis. To be quite honest with you, our statement has been that we actually think this should be stopped. Like no child, zero, no one. No one under 30 years old should be vaccinated based on the evidence and based on your very low risk. And not to get myself in trouble, I would even go further. And I've always argued that if you're 70 years old and below and you're healthy and you know no risk factors, Dr. McCullough and they would argue that 50 is the cut point, is a more reasonable cut point. That if you're 50 years and younger and you have no underlying medical conditions, then you really have nothing to worry about with COVID, etc. And in terms of do I take any prophylaxis treatment or etc. But from the time they look at 50 years and over, and I think they did the math where from 50 and below, you have a less than 1% chance of hospitalization and death. But once you cross 50 with risk factors, your risk of hospitalization and death goes above 1%. And that's when we begin to look at people seriously. But the truth is, we know of 90-year-old people who've had COVID and they actually have underlying medical conditions and they survived and they got through it.
Well,
that was his mother.
We have a personal story here.
Okay.
My mother was 92 years old and got COVID in December. She had, interestingly, largely GI symptoms. actually pretty profound GI symptoms. And she got through COVID, and, you know, she's frail, elderly. But the story gets significantly worse because she lives in Canada. She lives in the lower mainland of British Columbia. My brother and I live down here on the West Coast, and Canada was so sealed up with their border that my mother got a secondary illness, which was probably, you know, which ultimately became terminal, had nothing to do with COVID. And we couldn't go there and visit her, see her in hospice, or go to her memorial because the border's closed and you have to go into a COVID jail in Canada for 2 weeks at your own expense, et cetera, et cetera.
Even with being vaccinated.
Even with being vaccinated. And it says right on the, you know, the Canadian equivalent of the CDC.
We don't recognize the vaccine.
Yeah, we don't recognize vaccination as a mitigating strategy for entry into Canada. And I'm like, well, then this isn't about science or virology. It's about something, who knows? It's about tinfoil hats. I have no idea what it's about, but it's definitely not about medicine.
It's terrible, and it's and you know, you raise an important point with the restrictions on, like, in a place like Canada. I mean, in the United States and Canada and stuff, we figured out very early that the reason why so many people died in the nursing homes and the old age homes was because the staff were bringing in infection. And that was a problem, that they did not fix that throughout the entire pandemic, and it still really is not addressed. The staff, every time there's an outbreak, I have family in this situation, and every time there's an outbreak in an elderly home, they let us know that it's a staff member that just came in infected, so the home now has to be locked down. But our elderly people are treated so terribly. I mean, the old age homes the nursing homes, they have a big problem on their hands, but dealing with a pandemic. But the thing is, you know, when you lock the elderly in their rooms and they can't shower, they can't see their family, there's no interaction, the dementia escalates so quickly, and they pass away. And it's a terrible situation. In the most, you know, when you ask an elderly person, because I've spoken to some people and I've asked them, and they said, you know, all we want to be we just want to be left alone, and we want to just live the last months of our lives free, see our family, you know, see my grandkids and stuff and that. So it's really outrageous what we have done to our elderly. I think that's one of the crimes of this pandemic.
Yeah, we're seeing it everywhere, right from the neighborhood where my father lives, you know, in his little cul-de-sac area where there's elderly people, and you know, whether they're going to get the vaccine or not, they're like, we don't want to be locked up. I mean, we will rather take the risk of death because we're at the end of our life. We've had a great life. And then there's that infamous story. I don't know if you've heard about it. I think the elderly woman actually lived in the Toronto area who had lived through the first wave of lockdowns when COVID initially came, and then faced with another lockdown situation again as they were rolling out. She said, I would rather die than have to be locked down again and not see my family. And in fact, I can't remember.
No, she went to her physician with the, you know, the medical assistance in dying program that they have in Canada. And she said, I would rather die than go through another lockdown. She was declining. She was super active. She was in her 90s. And she's like, I'm not going to do this. It's going to kill me just sitting here. So forget it. So they let her out of COVID jail, and she got to hang out with her family and do all this nice stuff because she wasn't going to go back into the nursing home and potentially infect anybody else. So she gets out, has a nice day, a nice dinner, has a weekend with her family. They put grandma in bed and they inject her like a golden retriever.
With the lethal injection.
And they killed this lady because she didn't want to go back to a lockdown. And they thought that was a reasonable way, you know, use of the medical assistance in dying program in Canada. I couldn't, when I first heard it, I said, I'm getting punked. This is not true. And I researched it and I found it. And it was a CBC article from, you know, one of their affiliates in Ontario. And I was just stunned.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a true story.
Yes, it's true. I'll find the link and I'll send
find
it
the
to
link
you.
and we will send you the link. And it wasn't, you know, InfoWars or whoever.
No, it's totally true.
It was, and they're interviewing the kids. Oh, it was great to see mom and she got what she wanted. And I'm like, good Lord.
Yeah, I'll find it. Yep. For real. Wow.
So we're struggling with this situation here. So we only hope that we want to see what the CDC and the FDA is going to do in the next few days with these vaccines, given the rise in the myocarditis and stuff. But it's a really troubling situation.
Absolutely.
It sure is.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Any last final words or things you want to say with regards to, I mean, obviously very clear about kids probably should be at this point on hold for vaccines. I mean, now that what's coming out right now with the myocarditis data, any parting last words that that you want to put out there?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, has been such a pleasure to get a chance to speak to you guys. The thing is that I think the pandemic is closing out, and we've always had the option of early outpatient treatment. I'm sure Dr. Reese spoke to you about that, and I know you know what that is about. And I think that is the option that had we used that from the beginning, the society could have been left, uninterfered with. And WHO in 2019, to close off, they had developed a pandemic plan, and they had published it for all nations. And in that plan, they looked at all of the strategies that they've used today. All these countries use lockdowns, school closures, and they pretty much, in their own pandemic plan, said that all of those could be very catastrophically harmful. And the only two things that emerged that are recommended conclusively is, in a pandemic, is improved hand washing and isolation of only symptomatic ill people, nobody else. No quarantine of asymptomatic persons, no mass testing of asymptomatic persons, none of it. It's very harmful. Just isolation, quarantine of persons with symptoms or who have a strong clinical suspicion, and hand washing. And even Dr. Henderson, who eradicated smallpox, he wrote a paper in 2006, and he said it was on pandemic planning, and he said that the least disruption that a society can do in a pandemic is the best for it to come out of the pandemic in a successful manner. Any efforts to lock things down, close schools, etc., is very destructive, and he highly does not recommend it. And he said even for more lethal pathogens, he will not recommend it. So I think everything that we did was wrong. When you look at all of the science today, the lockdowns, the school closures, the mask mandates, every single step we took, the masking, how it was done, they've all failed because they were all ineffective, and we knew that from the beginning. And they continued it on, and they've suffered people, and many good people died because they couldn't hold on, and they couldn't deal with the loss of their independence and the unnecessary lockdown and the closure of businesses and the loss of income. It's just been a failure that I think the pandemic response will go down as probably the greatest public health disaster ever.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing that in my, at least, medical practice career that I think came close was our overprescription of opioids, and making this massive, which was based on zero science, by the way, massive appetite for opiates in North America, which then, of course, turns to heroin, turns to fentanyl, et cetera, et cetera. And, what is that, 70, 80,000 deaths a year in the United States from opioid overdoses? So, but this was the entire world of groupthink. Really, I am a man of many words, and I just struck dumb.
Yeah.
I'm dumbstruck by what's gone on in the last year, and the tearing apart of the fabric of society. I mean, we have a very good friend who is young and healthy and robust and not vaccinated, and the neighbors are like, we don't want to talk to you because you're not vaccinated. Well, they're vaccinated, so if they totally believe in the vaccine, this person's family is of zero consequence to them. But it's this culty stuff. Like, it's just really weird.
Yeah.
So
it's a lot of tragedy. It's a lot of tragedy. And I think what you just said is very key, that it's how we're going to repair the societies after this, because it's been torn apart.
Absolutely.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you so much.
I would love to come on again if ever you want to have me.
We will love to have you back.
Sure. Let's keep in touch and just let me know.
You bet. Well, that was highly informative. It's interesting. The more you start to look at what's been going on in the last year, I honestly feel more confused than I do certain about almost anything. The deconstruction of 2020 and 2021 is going to be one of those things that, Nobel Prizes are awarded for, 25 years from now. I mean, it really is kind of been an amazing experience. And it was just such a privilege to have Dr. Alexander with us. We need to do a shout out. It is July 1st. So to all our Canadian friends, happy Canada Day. If any of you guys still do that. It's like, okay, I'm going to go in the backyard and get like super wasted playing horseshoes and drinking Labatt's. You want another beer, eh? Well, of course I do. So happy Canada Day, eh?
If you're still listening to this at this far along, thanks for being here.
It's because you had so many Labatt's you fell asleep listening to the podcast.
Cheers and celebrate safely to our Canadian family and friends. And don't forget to visit locumstory.com or drpodcastnetwork.com/locumstory to get real, unbiased answers to all your locum tenens questions.
Fantastic. We shall see you next week.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
Well, we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.